children, I just want to mention a new book that you may want to check out that was written by our friend Homer Tadangar, who is here with us tonight. Homer, this is her book. Growing Up Global offers a toolkit to help kids of all ages engage with the world. And finally, if you're in your 20s or 30s, we invite you to the Council's Young Professionals Gathering that will take place downstairs at Tavern 17 immediately after this evening's program. Your involvement and passion is important to us. We hope you take advantage of this opportunity to discuss today's presentation and to network with other young professionals in the Council. Finally, we are delighted to have the United Way of Southeastern Pennsylvania Women's Initiative as a partner for this evening's program. The mission of this initiative is to advance the common good by mobilizing women leaders to improve the lives of at-risk adolescent girls and to help them develop the 6 fundamental pillars of their character: trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship. Through Girls Today, Leaders Tomorrow program, the Women's Initiative supports positive community and school-based activities for girls via public education, advocacy, volunteer mobilization, and funding. It is my pleasure to introduce Jill Michael, President and CEO of United Way of Southeastern Pennsylvania, who will introduce our guest of honor.
Thank you so very much, Peter, and it is my absolute honor to have the opportunity to introduce this evening's guests. The Council is delighted to welcome Nicholas Kristof back to the podium after several years, and is thrilled to have Sheryl WuDunn join us tonight for the first time. Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn are Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists and authors, and, last but not least, husband and wife. Their most recent book, Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women Worldwide, has already become a New York Times bestseller since its release last month and is the subject of this evening's discussion. Mr. Kristof, who joined the New York Times staff in 1984 and has been a columnist for the newspaper since 2001, and Ms. WuDunn, who served as the Times foreign correspondent, together were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for their joint coverage of the Tiananmen Square democracy movement in 1990, the first married couple and the first Asian American to win this prestigious award for journalism. They also co-authored 2 earlier books, China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power, and Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia. They don't always do everything together, though, and each have been very successful in their own right. With a background in banking and an MBA from Harvard University, Sheryl was a lead correspondent for The Times, and she was The Times' first television anchor for its nightly headlines broadcast, and helped develop a 4-hour documentary on China for the Times Discovery Times channel. In addition to the Pulitzer Prize, Ms. WuDunn has won the Polk and Overseas Press Club Awards, and she's currently an investment advisor with a focus on philanthropy, something certainly near and dear to my heart. Nicholas Kristof initially covered economics when he arrived at the New York Times and later served as the Times correspondent in Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He's lived on 4 continents, reported on 6, traveled to more than 140 countries and all 50 states. Mr. Kristof won his second Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for his commentary on the genocide in Darfur, and he's also the recipient of the George Polk Award, the Overseas Press Club Award, and the Online News Association Award. Please join me in welcoming our 2 very accomplished guests.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back here. Was anybody here in one of my previous talks? You're kind of dating yourselves, actually, I think, because it has been a while, but it really is good to be back, and I'm especially glad that I can bring Sheryl along with me. In the past, we have 3 kids, and we always wanted to be responsible to leave the kids behind. I'm not sure whether the kids have grown more responsible as they've gotten older. We've grown more irresponsible, but here we are. And we also had the chance to meet earlier some of the students who are here, and you should be really proud of the programs you're doing with these students. They are a very impressive group of young people, and so hats off to you for that. I want to start off by telling you about a very different kind of a school, one in China. This is a school that I visited in 1990 in Hubei province in the Dabia Mountains. And this is a girl named Dai Manju and her principal in a little village called Yejuao. And Dai Manju was a 6th grader, the brightest kid in the school, and she had to drop out because she didn't have $13 in school fees. And it was partly that her parents were very poor, didn't have a lot of money, and I think partly the fact that she was a girl, and her parents didn't really think that spending $13 on a girl's education was a great priority. Well, I wrote a front page story in the New York Times about how this incredibly bright kid had to drop out of school because she didn't have $13. And so pretty soon I began to get a lot of checks in the mail from readers who wanted to help Dai Manju. Most of those checks were for $13. The New York Times readers can be a little bit cheap sometimes, present company excluded. But I also got one wire transfer for $10,000. And so we took the money down to the Dabia Mountains and gave it to the authorities after working out a plan. And they promised that since the dropout issue was particularly a problem for girls, that they would guarantee that Dai Manju and every other girl in that community could remain in school, tuition-free, as long as she was academically capable. That for the first time in this village, staying in school would be a function of your intellect, not of your chromosomes. And well, so we went back to Beijing and called up the donor to give him a report. And so we said, you just would not believe how far $10,000 will go. You were incredibly generous. But there was a long pause and sort of a confused pause, and the guy at the other end of the line said, well, I mean, that's great, but I didn't give $10,000. I gave $100. Uh-oh. So, as a trained investigative reporter, I sensed a problem. Well, it turned out that indeed he had sent just $100, and a banker at Morgan Guarantee Trust Company had had a problem with decimal places. Presumably that banker was later put in charge of subprime mortgages. So I'm not hugely proud of what I did next. It was kind of, I suppose, a bit of bullying, but I called up the chief spokesman. I think I just lost the... Can you hear me okay? No.
Okay.
Testing? Oh, there we go. Revived. Morgan Guarantee is evidently in charge of the mics here. So I called up the chief spokesman for the bank, and I explained the situation, and then I said, now, on the record, is Morgan Guarantee going to send a lot of bankers out to get that money back out of the hands of these little girls who are finally able to go to school? And he said, under the circumstances, we're pleased to make a donation of yours. Well, we've continued following what happened in that village over the years, and it's been fascinating to watch. All of the villages in Hubei province have gotten richer over time, gotten better educated over time. There have been more opportunities throughout the province. But this village has truly been different from any other. Because these girls got so much more education, you had a transformative effect on the entire community. Dai Manju herself became the first child in her family to graduate, the first person in her family to graduate from elementary school, from middle school, from high school, and then she earned an accounting degree from the equivalent of a community college. She became an accountant in Guangdong province in the coastal areas. And so many of these other young women did the same. They sent money back, partly to support the education of other young people, partly to build a stronger community to support their parents. Because this community became richer, it was then able to persuade the authorities to build a road to the village for the first time, to bring electricity to it for the first time. And that created a virtuous cycle of economic development in that area. And it was all a great test example of what happens when you do get this sudden, unexpected outside infusion focusing on girls getting an education. What that can do not only for the girls in question, but for this larger community. Everybody gained from that experiment. And that goes very much to the themes of Half the Sky, of our book, and why we wrote it. The first central theme of Half the Sky focuses on on what is lost. And when one looks at the case of a kid who drops out of school, one can think about that's a waste of education resources. But when you realize it's all the girls who are dropping out, you see it's fundamentally about gender. So the first theme of the book is that just as in the 19th century, the central moral challenge was slavery. In the 20th century, it was totalitarianism. In this century, the paramount moral challenge is going to be to provide gender equity around the world. When I say that, I often encounter a certain skepticism, but clearly that is not the case right here. But I think that people often are kind of skeptical. I think I mean that in some kind of hyperbolic sense, but we really don't. And one measure of why we don't is the impact of discrimination in many countries. Let me ask you a question. Are there more males or females in the world today? Let's do a show of hands here. How many think there are more? How many think there are more males in the world today? Raise your hand. How many think there are more females in the world today? I'm afraid you're wrong. More males. In the U.S. and in Europe, there are more females because given equal access to food and health care, women live longer, and so there are more females. But worldwide, that is not the case. In many countries, there is a great deal of sex-selective abortion. If a woman is expecting a baby girl, then she gets an abortion. She doesn't if she's expecting a baby boy. On top of that, you have a major denial of food and health care to baby girls. This is a feeding center from a feeding center in Ethiopia. And you look at it, and what you initially see is starvation. But what you also need to know is that every kid in that feeding center was a girl. And this girl's brothers were doing just fine. And fundamentally, what happened was that there wasn't enough food to go around. The family feeds the sons and starves the daughters. And this is something that is deeply embedded in many cultures. In India, for the first year of life, male and female mortality levels are fairly similar because the breast is more or less gender blind. The breast does not particularly discriminate. But from age 1 to age 5, girls are 50% more likely to die than boys. And partly that's because mothers themselves in India are only half as likely to take their daughters to be vaccinated as to take their sons. When you add all of this up, it amounts to something like 100 million women who are missing from the planet. 100 million. And when you think of gender discrimination in those terms, a lethal discrimination that has cost 100 million lives, more than men died in all the battlefields of the 20th century, then you can see why this really does feel like a paramount cause of our times. And quite aside from the mortality, there are vast issues with violence, as you know. In parts of Liberia, parts of Congo, 3/4 of women have been raped. In the last few days, if you follow the news, something similar has happened in Guinea. In South Africa, there was a poll this year in which 25% of South African men said that they had raped somebody. Then there are other kinds of non-sexual attacks. This is a woman in Cambodia who had acid thrown in her face by her husband, who was not prosecuted. And acid attacks are, again, something that happens in a lot of places, and acid is always thrown in the faces of women, almost never men. But there's another, so that is one theme of the book, this all this oppression collectively adds up to the central challenge for our time. But the second theme is that at the end of the day, women and girls aren't the problem, they're the solution. And I think it's increasingly evident that if we want to fight poverty, if we want to fight extremism, terrorism, violence, then the most effective way to do it, quite apart from the issues of justice involved, the most effective way to do that is to educate girls, bring women into the formal economy, and reduce the marginalization of women in so many of these societies. There are a number of reasons for that. One has to do with fertility, that if you want to address rising birth rates in so many of these countries, again, the way to do that is by educating, empowering women. That's the most effective way to bring down those birth rates. Another has to do with the dirty little secret of development, which frankly is the way money is spent. And an awful lot of the worst suffering in poor countries is due not only to low incomes, but also to bad spending decisions disproportionately by men. There's been growing research on this. It suggests, we go through it in the book, that in families where the per capita income is less than $1 per day, which is one of the typical metrics of poverty, global poverty, that those families spend about 2% of their incomes across a broad range of cultures on educating their kids, which has a real positive net economic return. It's a great investment. In contrast, about 20% goes to a combination of alcohol, tobacco, prostitution, sugary drinks, and very extravagant festivals. And if you could just take, say, 4 percentage points from that 20 and add it to the education pile, you would revolutionize the prospect of these countries. But the most effective way to do that is to give women more control over those purse strings. Another way in which educating and empowering women tends to promote the economic development of these countries as a whole is simply that the greatest untapped resource that poor countries typically have is precisely the female half of their populations. Bill Gates was speaking in Saudi Arabia a few years ago. Somewhat similar audience, except that about 2/3 were men, and there was a barrier in the middle of the audience, and a small number of women on the right-hand side. And he spoke, and then afterwards somebody raised his hand and said, "Mr. Gates, Saudi Arabia has the goal of becoming one of the top 10 countries in technology by the year 2010. Is that feasible?" Gates looked out and said, "Well," he said, "this is Bill of Arabia." He said, "If you're not fully utilizing half the talent in your country, you're not going to get very close to the top 10. And that's precisely the issue. Again, quite apart from issues of justice, just a purely pragmatic issue of utilizing the resources that poor countries have available, and you have to do that by educating, empowering women, bringing them into the formal economy. Thank you very much, and now I'm going to pass the microphone over to Sheryl.
Can you see me over back there? Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about what an agenda would look like. At the top of the agenda would be what I would call sex slavery. When I use the term slavery, I thought that word actually was extinct. But here is a group of girls in Cambodia forced into prostitution. And it never really dawned on me what that really meant. I knew intellectually that girls were captured, they were kidnapped, they were sold into brothels, and they weren't paid. And then we went to Cambodia and we met Long Pros. Long Pros really drove home to me what it meant when we talked about sex slavery. She was captured and kidnapped when she was very young, sold to a brothel, and when she resisted, the brothel owner gouged out her eye. Now, unfortunately, there are too many girls like Long Pros. You know, in Half the Sky, Nick really
we talk about how Nick actually went to find out what it was like in these Cambodian brothels, and he purchased 2 girls, and he actually even got the receipts for those 2 girls that he purchased. They are, it happened partly because on an earlier trip when we were living in Asia, he had spent an afternoon in the Cambodian brothels, as a reporter, of course, interviewing 2 girls who were 14 and 15. The 15-year-old, it turns out, had been sold by a neighbor, had been actually duped into, traveling to a brothel by her neighbor, and then was sold to the brothel. And the mother had spent the entire, ensuing years searching for her daughter. And just a week before Nick had arrived at the brothel, the mother had found the daughter in that brothel. And so Nick naively asked, well, why are you still here? And she said, well, the brothel owner told my mother that he had paid good money for me. And so if she wanted me back, she would have to buy me back. And my mother didn't have the money. So Nick knew that he had a front page story, but that the girls would be stuck in the brothel and that they would probably die of AIDS. So the next time he went back to Cambodia, again as a reporter, he decided to do something different. So beforehand he called up the lawyers at the New York Times and asked them, does the New York Times have a policy on buying human beings? The lawyer sort of scratched his head and said, no, the New York Times doesn't have a policy on buying human beings. Why? So the next time he went to Cambodia, he actually purchased straight net and straight mom. Straight net and straight mom. And, it's a long story with lots of ups and downs. We describe their stories in Half the Sky. But in the end, you can, with a little bit of help, you can basically turn girls like straight mom and straight net into productive assets in society. The second item on the agenda would have to be maternal mortality. I don't know how many of you know about maternal mortality, but around the world, there are women dying in childbirth, during labor, when they're pregnant, every single minute. That's the equivalent of about 5 jumbo jets filled with women dying every single day. It's pretty remarkable. In Niger, 1 woman in 7 is expected to die in labor or childbirth. Just think if men had uteruses, what would be at the top of the global agenda, the top priority? You bet, paternal mortality. It's a global scandal, and it's just remarkable that it isn't on the top of the agenda right now. Even beyond maternal mortality, for every 1 woman who dies in childbirth, there are 20 who actually are just injured, partly because of labor, or they're too young, their bodies aren't mature enough. One of the worst kinds of injuries is called fistula, obstetric fistula. I don't know, how many of you know of those? Great. It is one of the worst kinds of injuries to suffer for women. Mahabula. This is a woman who, actually, she was a girl when her parents sold her. Her parents married her off to a husband. She was like 12 or 13. He basically raped her. She got pregnant and had a kid, and basically tried to deliver when she was 13 alone. She ran away and tried to deliver in the bush on her own. Well, she obviously was her body was too immature, and the baby died, and she actually suffered a fistula. And that meant that she was incontinent. She could not control her wastes. So she was stuck, she was this smelly young girl that no one wanted to take in. So the village, no one wanted to take her in, so the villagers took her to a hut at the edge of the village. They put her in that hut, And then they ripped down the door so that the hyenas would get to her. So that night, she fought off the hyenas with a stick. And then the next morning, she dragged herself to a nearby village and knocked on the door of a missionary, half dead. The missionary took her in, took her to a hospital, the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital, and she was repaired. And now Mahabuba is the nurse at the hospital. It turned out she was quite bright. And thank goodness that she was saved. She's now helping many women, just hundreds of women, with fistulas. So she really has become an extremely productive asset in society. So, you can see how women really can be turned around. But I've talked a lot about two very depressing topics. I want to actually talk about something that gets back to what Nick was saying. Women are part of the solution. They are the solution, not the problem. And they are. So two areas that I want to talk about. One is microfinance, which probably a lot of you have heard about, economic empowerment. So basically, what that is that you give a woman a loan. It turns out that she pays it back. She's more likely to pay it back than a man in the developing world. That's why Grameen Bank, I think many of you know Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize for his work at Grameen Bank. 99% of the clients at Grameen Bank are women. He started out, trying to be a little bit more equitable and said, 90% were women, and so he'd give more loans to men. But then he just wasn't getting the kind of paybacks on the loans that he needed. So now it's up to 99%. This woman is Simon. She lives in a village outside of Lahore, Pakistan, and she was married to a husband who basically beat her every single day. He did not have a job and took his frustration out on her every day. When she had a second girl, her mother-in-law basically told her son, "You better get another wife. She's never going to bear you a son." This is the mother-in-law. I don't think central casting could have done a better job. It just so happens at that time, there was a microlending institution in the village, and they gave Saima a $65 loan. These are micro loans, tiny loans, $65. And Saima, was pretty good with the needle. She did embroidery, and so she just decided she'd start an embroidery business. Well, the merchants actually really liked it, and her stuff was selling. So she kept producing some embroidery, and when she couldn't produce enough, she started hiring other families in the village. It soon got to be 30 families she was hiring, and she was making so much embroidery that transporting all the goods to the market was becoming quite burdensome. So she hired her husband to do it. So he had a job finally, and now she's not beaten anymore. No one talks about a second wife, and Simon just had her fourth girl. So really, it can be transformative. She's clearly the local tycoon in the village. She's transformed the village. So it really can be a real boost. Let me tell you a story of another woman. This is an education story. If you educate the girl, you really can do a lot for society. Even Larry Summers, when he was chief economist at the World Bank, said that it might well be that the highest return investment in the developing world is investing in girls. Larry Summers. So, it's basically the idea is that you invest in a girl. She gets a job, can earn income, and contribute that to the family household income, which then, if you aggregate it all up to the village level, to the county level, to the national level, that raises the GDP. This is Beatrice. So Beatrice, oh, do you know her?
I've met her.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's wonderful. So you know her story. She's a wonderful girl, but when she was 9 years old, she had not even gone to school. Her parents, they lived in Uganda and near the Congo border, and she, if she were a boy, they probably would have sent her to school, but she was a girl. And it just so happens that there was a church in Connecticut, the Neontic Church in Connecticut, that made a donation to a non-profit organization in Arkansas called Heifer International, and I bet a lot of you know Heifer, to donate some goats. One of those goats went to Beatrice's parents, and that goat happened to be pregnant with twins. So they had the twin goats, and they produced a lot of milk that the parents then sold for cash. So as the cash started accumulating, well, we thought, gee, we have enough money to send Beatrice to school. She was 9 years old, and so she went to first grade because she had never been to school, and she was there with the sixth grade. She didn't care. She loved school, rocketed to the top of the class. Turns out she was quite brilliant. She went all the way through school and became the first person in her village to actually go to America to college. In June 2008, she graduated from Connecticut. She graduated from Connecticut College. And she says that she is the luckiest girl in the world because of a goat. So, you know, there's another example of really a transformative experience. You really can make a difference. A goat costs $120, so it doesn't take that much to have a transformative effect. So, I mean, these are great stories, but I have to say that, you know, we need a reality check too, because aid does not always work. There has been a lot of criticism of aid, and I think we do have to recognize that it doesn't always work. Anybody who has traveled throughout the developing world has seen failed aid projects or schools built where the teachers no longer, you know, go to school to teach. You know, the classrooms that sit empty, or the clinics, the doctors don't show up. And it's true, we have to acknowledge that that is a problem. But that doesn't mean that you don't see aid projects that do work, and you see plenty of them. You know, here are just some examples. So we wrote Half the Sky really as a kind of do-it-yourself foreign aid toolkit. So we wanted to show that each individual can really make a difference in the lives of people in the developing world or around the world. And so we do have a list of organizations in the back of the book that you can you know, try and work with. We have a website called halftheskymovement.org that you can go to look and see how you can actually just give of yourself. I mean, it's not just the money. I mean, it's really, we want you to join this effort because it really can help change the world. So what's in it for you? There is something in it for you. You know, there are very few things in life, once you have satisfied all the basic needs, your basic material needs, there are very few things in life that actually elevate your level of happiness. Contributing to a larger cause like this one it's one of those things that can really elevate your level of happiness. So there's something in it for you. You know, really, foreign aid, the record on helping others is kind of mixed. The record on helping yourself is really good. So we hope that you will join the movement, feel happier, and help save the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much to Sheryl and Nick for that really in so many ways a huge wake-up call, I think, for all of us as to how do we really capitalize on the talents of women throughout this entire world. So we deeply appreciate it. Our guests have graciously agreed to spend a little bit more time with us to take a few questions tonight. So I'll ask folks who have any questions to please step up to the mic.
The division of labor is that I take easy questions, Sheryl takes hard questions.
Thanks for your inspirational work. It's wonderful just to see you in person after reading about what you've been doing and over the years. I just wanted to know, if you were Barack Obama, or you were in charge of the United States foreign policy, what would you recommend to kind of scale up these efforts in a way that's going to make a difference and not hopefully avoid the flaws of foreign aid that we've had in the past.
Well, after ordering all Americans to subscribe to the New York Times, trying to rescue our business model a little bit. I mean, USAID, the American Aid Agency, is deeply flawed, and I think it does need to be rethought. It is going to be rethought. There are some examples of the kinds of programs that I think we need to look at. Pakistan has been kind of instructive in that since 9/11 we've spent $11 billion of American money in Pakistan that has accomplished nothing in terms of stabilizing Pakistan. Much of that money has been used to increase Pakistan's military capabilities vis-a-vis India, which makes no sense, or to go after Baluchis in Baluchistan domestically. And it certainly hasn't contributed to any kind of greater support for the U.S. within Pakistan. Now, in contrast, we had spent some small share of that money within Pakistan and education in particular. I think that would indeed have been a real investment over time in creating some kind of greater stability in Pakistan. I think there's now a recognition that that is the case. And it's not a magic bullet. None of this is. It wouldn't produce instant returns, but it's now been long enough since 9/11. I think we would have seen a very different trajectory. We also describe in End of Half the Sky some specific examples of the kinds of programs that we would love to see the administration take over. One, a major global girls' education program. A second, a maternal health program. And I think these would both reflect American soft power. I think they would both bring dividends to the U.S. As well. And the third is something that, or a third is something we never really think about, but it has to do with micronutrients and maybe the most cost-effective investment one can make, and that is iodine, iodizing salt. We don't think of iodine, but a third of people in the developing world don't have enough iodine in their bodies. And the problem is not as much goiters, which is what we think of. The problem is that if a pregnant woman doesn't have enough iodine in her body, then her baby, her fetus's brain will not develop properly, especially a female fetus for reasons we don't fully understand. And that baby, when it is born, will lose 10 to 15 IQ points, and that will be a lifelong deficit. Now, we can reach each person for about 2 cents with iodized salt, and it is just a crime that we're not doing that because it's not a glamorous kind of aid, and so that there are so many babies being born with this kind of deficit that can be repaired particularly well. So those are some examples of the kinds of projects we would love to see the administration take on. And I mean, Obama, because his mother was indeed engaged in microfinance, I think he does intellectually get these kinds of issues, but he's been obviously very absorbed with other issues. We'll see what happens to USAID.
I would add actually that when people have made the suggestion that you blow up USAID and restart it, and I think that actually is a good idea if one can do that, because there's so many earmarks and to really just trying to do something that really works. Foreign aid, it was built up under the old foreign aid system that everybody criticizes, and it needs to really rejuvenate itself. But also, it's really important to recognize that the administration change does not come about just from the top down. So whatever Obama does, it's just not going to change the world unless there's also a groundswell of opinion from the bottom up. It has to be bottom up as well as top down. And he might do one or two things, but the bottom, the grassroots movement that really holds the politicians' feet to the fire is what will actually bring about change. It has to be both bottom up and top down.
Next question.
Thank you. So I was just going to make a comment first and then a question, because you mentioned Pakistan and what's going on there. There is a wonderful school in Lahore, Pakistan, that's going on right now that is all funded by locals, actually, truthfully, in which the principal has said for every son, you'll have to send a daughter as well, so you see that. And also, I personally have a deep interest in that school, and in fact, one of the classrooms has been named after my husband, who was deceased 3 years ago. But that's really not my point, but you mentioned Pakistan before. And so my question is really kind of simple. It's not complicated. And that is, of the countries that you've seen, where is the most hope that you have? And in those countries, what can this group do? What can we help? How can we help?
Well, maybe reflecting your question a little bit, I mean, I think often when people look at countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, other places where really nasty things happen to women, there's this sense that these practices are deeply embedded in these cultures and are not going to change very easily. And the best answer to that is, frankly, China. China 100 years ago was maybe just about the worst place in the world to be born female. You had foot binding, you had child marriage, you had concubinage, you had girls in rural areas sometimes not even being given a name, just a third daughter, this kind of thing. And that has been completely transformed. And the beneficiaries of that have been not only Chinese girls and women themselves, but have been everybody, the entire population. People recognize that. Cheryl's grandmother had her feet bound. And that after being around for hundreds of years, that ended in one generation. So I think that we can indeed see changes. Bangladesh is another great example. It used to be part of Pakistan. The one thing they really did differently was they educated girls. And so partly as a result, there are now more girls in high school in Bangladesh than there are boys. That laid the groundwork for Bangladesh's garment industry, for its economic development, for the success of Grameen and BRAC and other NGOs, and for the stability that we see in Bangladesh today relative to Pakistan. So there really is hope out there. Change is possible, but it can indeed be nudged along a little bit.
It was funny. We were yesterday in Boston, and there was a student from Karachi who was studying development, and he had said that he had spent his summer as an intern in Bangladesh. So he grew up in Pakistan, and he spent his summer in Bangladesh. And we were telling him about the girls' education, how important it was in Bangladesh. He sort of had an aha moment. He said, you know what? I realized now, one of the happiest moments I had when I was in Bangladesh was watching the young girls in their uniforms, orange and white uniforms, and noticing that they had so much vitality. Because in my country, they all walk around with their heads down and very intimidated and very timid. He was not used to seeing girls like that. So it is really striking what education can do.
Next question. Okay.
I'm very interested in what happens to men in the societies, because I was in Africa and we tried to get the men to accept the idea of solar stoves, and they rejected it because the women had nothing to do all day. They didn't go out and search for wood. So, I just wonder what is going to happen when these women who do most of the work anyway are doing even more of the work and is earning the living also. And what happens to them? I mean, I've seen even in lots of countries there, they just sit around all day in Palava anyway. They're talking and deciding about all the big problems and not doing much of the work. What happens to these societies when women are making money also?
This really is a great question. I mean, because men and women have to bring about the change. It's not just the women. And it isn't just that men are jerks. I mean, it really isn't. They are jerks. It's just that in this patriarchal society, what's happened, which is kind of frightening as well, in some of these areas, the brothel owners are women. The women actually, in their surveys been done by the UN, that sometimes in some of these countries, 20% to 50%, as high as 50%, women are involved in perpetrating some of these, things like this, the brothel owners, as an example. So you really do have to educate them and incorporate them. So, for instance, in the case of Saima, it's not like her husband is, just wild about her being the business tycoon, but her status really has been raised within the household, and he has accepted it because now, he paid off her debt, she paid off his debts, and he now has everything paid for. He's a television. I mean, he really is enjoying the fruits of her work, and she's been able to find a use. He's found a useful job. But you're right. Integrating the men into the new sort of society is a challenge, but it has to happen.
Often, I think one sees at the beginning of the empowerment approach with an NGO when it moves into a community, one sees men really discomfited by this, very suspicious of it, and then ideally what happens is that the women, because they are engaging in some kind of a small business, then they begin to bring in more money to the family. And then at that point, the men begin to see that this really isn't a zero-sum game, but that they can be beneficiaries as well, that everybody will benefit. And there's in the book we talk about a family in Burundi that underwent this, and the man was initially deeply suspicious when his wife was supported by a care program that started with a $2 microloan. But then after a while, he ended up getting malaria, and the only way he could pay his hospital bill was with his wife's profit from her small business. And all of a sudden, he began to see female empowerment in a somewhat different light. And I think that has been the case otherwise. But also, as Sheryl says, that I think we exaggerate sometimes from afar the degree in which there is a battle of the sexes. And so often the problem is patriarchal attitudes that are absorbed and transmitted almost as much by women as by men. The thing that always strikes me is that if you, in surveys of wife beating, of whether you approve or disapprove of wife beating in developing countries, the best predictor of your attitude toward wife beating is not whether you were male or female, it's whether you live in a city or a rural area. In urban areas, men and women alike tend to think wife beating is a bad idea. In rural areas, women, almost as much as men, tend to think that, yes, that is appropriate. And education, I think, is the best solvent of those attitudes for men as well as women.
Your work has been so incredibly important in raising the visibility of the issues of maternal mortality and obstetric fistula. So my question has to do with female genital cutting. Today, there are 120 million women and girls who have had either part or all of their external genitalia removed through this procedure. So I'm just wondering where you feel this fits into your sort of agenda for female empowerment.
Actually, we talk about that in Have the Sky. That is a really, really tough cultural attitude that has to undergo change. And people have tried for years, foreigners and local people have tried for years. There is one NGO that we found that has had some success. Maybe you know about it, Tostan. But even that they have, Molly Melching went through an education process herself. This is a woman who went into an area to try and help change the attitudes towards genital cutting, and she was in this one village, and she thought she had achieved real success because she had gotten every woman in the village to publicly announce they were no longer going to cut their girls. She was just delighted. So they made this great announcement. It was a great failure. And that's because what happened was once you didn't cut your girls, then they were not marryable. They were not married. They couldn't marry. No one wanted them. What they realized they had to do was actually go to all the surrounding villages where there are potential husbands and get approval from each of those communities to agree that cutting was bad. So they did that. They educated the entire surrounding community and got buy-in. Once they got the buy-in, then everybody was okay with ending the cutting. And she achieved that. It's just that it took longer, but it's a great success, and now she's moving into different communities. It is a long process.
I just wanted to add that I think genital cutting is actually a great prism through which to look at what works and what doesn't work in development. And too often the humanitarian world has boasted about what works and has ignored failures. And in fact, you learn more from failures than you do from successes. And FGM is one good example of that. Since the 1970s, there's been a major international effort to reduce cutting it. Female circumcision was rebranded as female genital mutilation. There are international conferences held, laws were toughened on this. In Guinea now, cutting a girl is punishable by life imprisonment, in some cases by execution in others. Yet it's irrelevant. 99% of girls are still cut. This approach has largely failed. And yet, at the same time, this top-down international effort essentially failed. As Sheryl says, there have been some groups, including Tostan, based in Senegal, and others in Ghana, Somaliland, and other places, that have had a grassroots, bottom-up approach, and those have worked. And they've been focused not on standing in front of a crowd and holding a microphone and saying, don't do this, don't do that, but I'm listening to people and talking to them and empowering them. And I think that is a really useful lesson for development as a whole and the role of questioners in that process.
Next question.
Hi. I was wondering, before you guys started actively pursuing this cause, what was it that initially opened your eyes to the fact of female inequality around the world?
Actually, this has been a long journey. It started in China. When we were covering Tiananmen Square and were outraged by the fact that the Chinese government had killed, had basically shot at anywhere from 400 to 800 students. We thought this was terrible. It was front page news. We were horrified. And the next year, we started traveling around the countryside in China, and we discovered that there were some horrors out there that never got a column inch. And that was basically we discovered that every year in China, 39,000 girls die every year before they reach the age of 1, and that's because they left on the doorstep, never taken to the doctor. They just never got very far. And if you aggregate that, we did more digging. It turns out in China there were 30 million missing girls. You aggregate that, and that's 60 million to 100 million that Nick mentioned earlier. So that's when we started realizing over the years that this is a big problem.
Do you have time for one more question?
You probably have hit on this from other people's questions. However, I wanted to know how Islam and the Muslim community take to all of your ideas.
When I write about Pakistan or Afghanistan and about nasty things happening to women, for example, in those countries, there tends, quite understandably, to be a defensiveness. And I think a lot of it is rooted in, people want to be proud of what is reported about their countries in the New York Times, and they don't want their dirty laundry aired. And so even very, enlightened people are very uncomfortable about some of the kinds of reporting that is done in the book, because they think it portrays their country or their religion in a bad light. And I think it tends to be compounded in countries like Afghanistan when you get a bunch of Americans, whoever well-meaning, telling people that their women are oppressed and mistreated, when often those women themselves don't think that they are oppressed or mistreated, but just think this is the natural order of things. I mentioned FGM as one example of an international development approach that I thought had failed largely, the sort of top-down approach. Another, I'd say, would be Afghanistan and what happened after 9/11, that there were so many NGOs that went into Kabul, often with a mission of female empowerment. These were run by very well-meaning Americans. They accomplished very little. And at the same time, there were some Afghan NGOs run by local Afghan women who, as Muslims, often speaking Pashto or speaking Dari, had real credibility and local knowledge, to work outside of Kabul in rural areas that needed the most help. And if more of our efforts had gone to supporting those people, we would have got so much more bang for the buck and accomplished an awful lot more. And I think that where you have these kinds of sensitivities about religion, about culture, that we should try to reconceive the kind of role that we play the schools that we build in Afghanistan, for example, work so much better if these don't have big American fingerprints on them, but are perceived as locally on local schools. Greg Mortensen is very good about that, the 3 Cups of Tea author. He's very good at, these schools are perceived by 3 Cups of Tea donors as American schools, but in that local village, they are perceived as the local school, their school, and that's one reason why they have been, for the most part, immune from attacks from the Taliban and others. So I think there really is an important lesson there in how we can be more effective in our development approach in our interactions with countries like Pakistan or Afghanistan.
Thank you so very, very much. In some cases, deeply disturbing, but in a lot of cases, deeply heartening that there's folks like you actually out there looking out for the best interests of so many women across this country and across the world. So on behalf of the folks at World Affairs Council and those of us at United Way, we also want to thank all of you for coming this evening and taking the time. We hope that you enjoyed the program. For those of you who are attending the United Way reception after the program, please meet us in the Crystal Ballroom afterwards, down the hallway and to your left. For the young professionals, you're headed down to Tavern 17, and books are available for sale in the registration area as we leave. So thank you very much.